What's up, Covalence friends? Today we're going to be looking at styling your HTML elements with CSS measurement units. The differences between pixels, ems, rems, percentages, viewport width units, viewport height units, and all that fun. So let's get right into it. All right, so we're starting off with a blank index.html document. It does have a title and it does have a link to a style.css, which we actually already have in here. And I'm gonna go through that. I kind of pre-filled it a little bit, just kind of make things a little bit quicker and a little bit easier, but I will explain every single detail when we get there. But what we're gonna do is we're actually going to just add a few elements to our body. And we're gonna add a div with a class called container. And that's where we're gonna wrap all of our elements in. So we're actually going to create a bunch of boxes. So a bunch of div.boxes. And we are going to create, let's say 6 of them. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? And the first box, we're going to make blue and we're going to style with pixels. The second one, we're gonna do green and we're gonna style them with rems. The third one, let's do red and style it with ems. The fourth one, we can make purple and we'll make that percentage based. The fifth one, we can do yellow and we'll do that with viewport height units. And the last one we'll do black and we'll do a viewport width unit. So let's add some text. Let's say we love, let's see, to code at Covalence. All right, so this is pretty much all we're gonna need for our HTML, and we're gonna kind of show the differences between all of these and which ones we think, would make sense, to code with the majority of the time. It is more or less a stylistic preference, I would say, but I do think there are certain cases where it's important to kind of use one over the other, right? So let's go to our style.css here, and what we've done is we've actually created a root style with a font size of 16 pixels. So typically, you'd actually style with your HTML and your body. Now, the root size, which is basically what rems are based off of, is actually based off of the actual HTML. But it is a good idea to also set the body to the same as the HTML, just to kind of be a redundancy in case, some browsers are inconsistent with that. But regardless, this is your actual root font size here. So this is going to be 16 pixels. Usually the base browser font size by default is 16 pixels. So we're really just kind of reiterating the fact that we are solidifying our own base font size. And it's not a bad idea to do this in all of your projects, actually. We are styling the box element, or the box class, where we're just making the color white and we're text aligning everything to the center. And then we have our colors, right? Which is basically just setting the background color to the actual name of the class, basically. So we have blue, green, red, purple, yellow, black, right? And so that's pretty straightforward. Now, finally, we're styling our boxes based off of our class here. And we're actually setting width, height, margin, and padding. So we're making squares. So all of these should be squares. And you can basically see that we have all of our sizes here. So if you want to take some time to pause the video, copy this down, go for it. But basically you can kind of set these yourself as well. So pixels obviously uses all pixels, rems uses all rems, and I try to make them relatively the same. Now obviously one rem is going to be more than 10 pixels because the base font size is 16. So one rem is actually equal to 16 pixels. So using rems for using rems instead of pixels is basically not that big of a difference, right? So rems is basically the same as using pixels because for everything throughout your entire app, it's always going to equal 1 rem to 16 pixels. So 3 rems is actually going to equal 48 pixels. So you'll be able to see that, you'll be able to see the difference here. But ems is going to be the same as rems as long as we don't adjust any of the parent elements. Now, when you have a huge DOM tree, you might have font size adjusted multiple times throughout that, and every single time it's adjusted, it'll actually change the relationship here. So I'll kind of show you that as well. Now, percentage is based off of the width and height of the parent, except when it comes to margin and padding. Margin and padding is always based off of the width. Don't ask me why, that's how it's designed. I'm sure there's a really good reason. I've never even looked into it. But one of the big reasons I think is that divs by default don't have a height, right? So the height is auto. And the width is always going to be by default 100% if it's a static block element, right? Now, if it's a inline element, it's going to be content size And if it's an absolute element, it's also going to be content size. So that actually changes a lot of your CSS properties as well, right? If you're setting position absolute or you're setting display to inline, something like that, right? So that changes a lot of these properties and how they react with one another. Now, viewport height is basically off of the viewport height. So it's saying 8 viewport height units is going to essentially be 8% of the viewport height. So 100 VH is actually 100% viewport height. So that's how you kind of tell what these mean. So 2 VH is actually 2%. And so, that's essentially the exact same thing as percent to a certain degree, right? So for width and height, these should be the exact same width. And this is going to be different because margin and padding is 2%. It's actually 2% of the width of the container, right, of the parent container. And this is actually 2% of the viewport height, actually. So it's not basing the heights the same. Now, finally, viewport width is going to be almost identical to your percent here. And so 8VH is going to be 8% of the viewport width. So this width of percent and the width of VW should be the same. Now the height is going to be different because this height is based off of the height of the parent. And so we will get into that as well when we actually look into this. So let's go ahead and open this thing. And we're going to pop this open and look at this here. So let's go ahead and you actually saw that when I opened this, it changed the size of the browser and it affected some of these elements here. So you can see that we have our pixels here. Let's go ahead and shrink this a little bit. Let's go to about half size here. Make everything relatively close. But if we look at this, we can see this is our pixels, this is our REMs. Let's kind of pop this open a little bit more so we can actually look at all the boxes. Well, let's shrink this and shrink this. There we go. So we'll do here, and then we'll increase that a little bit. All right, so we can actually see our pixels here. We can see our REMs. We can see our Ms, right? Now, when we change the size of this, we'll actually see that the viewport width and the percent are going to be modified, right? Because as we get it bigger, it is actually growing in width, right? Now, the VW square is growing in width and height. It maintains its square shape. Now, the code block here is actually a rectangle, right? Which is kind of strange. You're wondering, why the heck is it a rectangle? Well, that's actually because the container doesn't have a height set on it. It's actually, its height is equal to essentially whatever the elements inside of it make it out to be. Like if we made all of these display none, its height would be 0, right? So if for instance, we just said box, we can come in here, we can say box is display none. Now, the height of the container is actually 0 here, right? So it's only equal to the height of its contents. So let's remove that property display none. And what we could actually do is we could set a class on here. We could create a class for container, and we could say height is equal to 100%. And then actually body should also be height 100% as well. So actually, let's just go ahead and we're gonna change this in our actual code. So we're gonna add font size 16 pixels, height 100%, and we're also going to add our container class to be height 100%. And we're gonna refresh this page here. And you can see we now have our square, right? So now this percentage is correct because we have 8% of the width, 8% of the height, which is, if the container is square, it's going to be a square as well. Now, if we extend this out now, we can see it starts to become a rectangle because the height is not changing. If we were to shrink this height-wise, you can see that our yellow and our purple now change height because they are directly correlated to the height of the container, and that's it though. Everything else stays static, right? So the width isn't changing, that's not changing. So basically everything else stays consistent. Now, if we were to take container and we were to adjust the font size of container, let's go ahead and do that. So we're gonna say font size is going to be, let's say 50%. It should affect the font size of everything on the page. So let's go ahead and let's pop open a new tab altogether. And you can actually see here, if we kind of shrink this to be about the same size, we can actually see here that our red M's box is significantly smaller, right? So it's 50% shrank the actual box itself. The pixels and the REMs stay consistent. If we toggle between these two, we can see that only the font inside of the container shrunk, but the actual size of the blue and green boxes remained almost exactly, I mean, it actually is exactly the same, right? Now the purple and everything else is different because we'd actually have to adjust these to be exactly the same. So let's say 701 roughly, 701. All right, so now if we switch between these two, basically the red box is the only thing changing. And that's because we're using M's. Now we can actually shrink this red box even more if we were to actually set the font size of the red box as well. So if we said .red, well, let's just do set the M's, that would make more sense. So we're gonna say font size of the M's box is going to be 50% as well. So now, when we pop this back open, if we open up another tab here, we can see that the red box is even smaller, right? So we have our 700, 701 about, right? There we go. So if we go between the two, we can see that the red box shrinks by 50%, and then it shrinks by another 50%, right? So that is because our container is shrinking the font size by 50%, and then the actual element class on the element is shrinking the font size by another 50%. So it's basically like illegible at this point. And it's going to keep doing that, right? So if we had multiple containers here, if we had, a container with a div within a div within a div, and then all of those adjusted the font size, it's going to affect this M all the way down here because that's basing all of its units off of M's, right? So if you went ahead and you changed the actual font size of the HTML and body now, let's just say you said that this font size was 12, or what we could actually do is we could set a media query. So we could say at media screen, and let's just say min width is 1024 pixels. We can say HTML body has a font size of, let's say, 24 pixels. All right. And when we do this, it's now going to increase the size of REMs and M's, right? So what we can actually look at now is, let's go ahead and pop this back open. Let's open up another tab. We will open that up, and we will pop this open, and we'll see that it's 700. All right, we have everything that looks identical to this tab. But now, if we should go above 1024, right, so we're going to go up to right there, that's the change. So above 1024, we have our M's and we have our REMs are changing size, right? So we have our M's here are at 19 by 19, so approximately 20 by 20, and now they are at 29 by 29, or approximately 30 by 30, right? So that change in font size affected the M's all the way down there. It also affected the REMs because the REMs are based off of only that root font size. So what does this mean, right? Well, basically it means that the different measurement units that you use for different properties or different objects are going to affect severely how your app actually reacts, right? So in today's world, when we're building responsive web apps and things like that, we want to make sure that we're using properties that actually make sense for the elements. So you may want to adjust font size without adjusting the actual unit or the actual size of the elements inside of it. In that case, REMs are obviously going to make a lot more sense. Pixels also would make sense for this. The problem with pixels is that it's completely static. No matter what you do, no matter what you change, the sizes are always going to be the same. Now, if you're trying to make something that's mobile responsive, what you could do is you could use all REMs throughout your whole application, and then you could, at different sizes, kind of like I did here, adjust your base font size, and that's going to affect essentially everything throughout your entire app. Now, that will change widths and heights and things like that, but if you need to keep font sizes, a certain size, then in particular, you may actually be able to get away with using ems everywhere. And actually, ems are my personal preference. And I actually enjoy using ems primarily because it gives me a little bit more finite control over individual blocks and elements than rems do. Now, it can get messy, right? Because you are adjusting font size significantly more. But I do think that if you have a good system and you keep things crystal clear, ems definitely give you the most control and the most ability to adjust everything within a certain area, because now at different screen points you can actually adjust the font sizes of container elements and not just the root font size. And I feel like that makes it a little bit more flexible and a little bit easier for adjusting, sizes of widgets, sizes of containers of pages, all of that. Right now, viewport width units and viewport height units are funny to me because for the most part I just feel like those are kind of like newer school, and I never really used those back in the day. But I do feel like they are pretty awesome, and I do actually love doing a little trick where a lot of the time what I'll do is I'll set the base font size, especially in something that's kind of like a mobile app or should be a mobile app. I'll set the root font size to a viewport unit, and by doing that it actually allows me to scale everything below a certain screen size. So I'll say maybe everything below 500 pixel screen size, so we're assuming kind of like a mobile device, is going to be font size based off of viewport units. And when you do that, everything will scale as long as you have something like rems or ems set for all of your containers. And the actual font size scales relative to your measurements. And so everything is perfectly consistent on every device size for your mobile devices. So again, that would be essentially setting your root font size to actual viewport unit width, so or a viewport unit height even. So again, that is something that you could play around with. Let's just say you said something like 2VH, right? So now as you scale, the font size and the units scale with it, right? So your font size, the proportions or the ratio of your font size to your units stay the same, which is nice. And that's really primarily for your units here, your ems and your rems and your ems, and then also it would be consistent for here as well because that's based off percentage. Now percentage, on the other hand, is something that you are going to want to get very familiar with and use all of the time for most of your measurements. If you can, I would use percentage for everything. The hardest thing about percentages is the height, right? So having your containers always have a height of 100% or making sure you're setting all of the heights of your containers just isn't realistic. You're not going to be able to always know what height your elements are going to be. And honestly, it kind of breaks a lot of HTML, CSS paradigms to begin with, because a lot of times you want the height of your elements to be just the height of the content. If you have, paragraphs of text, you have no idea how long those paragraphs are going to be. You can't just go ahead and set a height on your element, right? So that's what makes percentage-based heights and widths hard. Now you can always do percentage-based widths. That will never break. So again, you might want to just do some sort of combination of everything. Make sure that you have your widths all based off of percentage, whereas your heights are all based off of something maybe different, right? Ems or rems or maybe even viewport units. But one of the nice things about setting obviously the percentages is that if you change the width and height of your container, it's going to directly affect the width and height of its children elements, right? So if we have container in here, we have height 100%. If we set width equal to 50%, spelled that wrong. Oh. Right, so now we have our rectangle because the width is now 50% of what it was. If we set the height to be 50%, it should go back to being a square. So again, that's pretty common. Everybody usually knows about percentages. What they usually don't know about is the differences with these pixels, rems, and ems, and that you can actually use them for measurements and not just font sizes. Again, I like using ems. Rems are what is pretty common for most frameworks, like something like a Tailwind framework or a Bootstrap CSS framework, right? They'll primarily use rems because of the fact that it's all based off of its root font size, and it scales accordingly based off of what you choose as your root font size. All right, so I hope that was easy enough to understand. I tried to keep it pretty simple, but if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comment section below. If you guys haven't subscribed, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We are always releasing new content from beginner stuff like this lesson all the way to super advanced stuff as well. So check us out, check out all of the stuff that we put out already, and be looking out for more future content. I mean, if you have any suggestions or if you want anything in particular covered, feel free to also drop that in the comments below. Make sure you check out our community membership. It includes every course we've ever created for a super low price, and it's a lot of content. We don't have a ton of courses, but it's a ton of content within those courses. So it's definitely a quality over quantity. And yeah, link is in the description. Check out our merch. We have an awesome merch store as well. And until next time, get out of here.